Dragon Ball Z Battle of Gods came out in 2013, and it was the reinvigoration that the franchise needed. The original Dragon Ball Z anime had wrapped up way back in 1996, with its last film releasing around the same time. Sure, GT came a year later, but even then we were still looking at a solid 16-year gap from the main Dragon Ball timeline. During those years, the game stepped up as the main source of fresh content for fans, but they often stayed close to the established manga and anime canon, rarely venturing beyond the familiar arcs and characters. So, when Battle of Gods arrived, pushing the Z timeline forward, introducing new characters like Beerus and giving Goku a whole new transformation, it was clear a game would follow to capture the momentum. The timing couldn't have been better either, as Dragon Ball games on the 7th gen consoles were hitting a bit of a lull. They weren't bad exactly, they just didn't inspire the same excitement as the iconic PS2 titles. I think fans were just feeling a bit of franchise fatigue, with the rehashing of the Z arc over and over and over and over again. At least that was how I was feeling around this time. But now, with Battle of Gods, it was time for that to change, and in 2014, the world got Dragon Ball Z Battle of Z. The game released on PS3, Xbox 360, and the Playstation Vita. Apparently, the name Battle of Z felt perfectly fitting for what this game aimed to accomplish. The Z in the title drew on the concept of Zenkai, that ability unique to Saiyans, where they came back stronger after every defeat. It was a promise really, a comeback, a return to form for Dragon Ball gaming. At least that's what everyone was hoping for. What we ended up with was, well,
like 20...
When starting up Battle of Z for the very first time, the only mode available is single player. I think the reason why the game is so restricted at the very beginning is because they want to make sure that every player plays through at least the first few missions of the single player mode, as they are also the game's tutorials. The single player menu is quite unique, to say the least. When seeing it for the first time, I was quite confused as to what I was looking at, but it is actually a good menu and is very efficient once you get used to how it works. It's called the revolver menu, and there are 4 character slots where you can pick your team. The player slot is for the character you want to control during a mission, and the other slots are for your teammates. However, before you can select any characters, you will need to select a mission first, and as soon as I opened the mission menu, I sighed. Once again, a Dragon Ball game insists that we start at the Saiyan saga. Again. I don't know why the games are so afraid to deviate from the Z arc, as this would have been the perfect game to do so. The franchise was primed for exploring beyond Z, and I think the game would have benefited greatly if it had just skipped ahead a bit in the timeline, or even just had a completely unique story. And I use the term story very loosely, as we will soon see. Anyway, the first few missions in the Saiyan saga are pretty much just used as tutorials. The very first mission will have you playing solo as Goku as he senses a disturbing power source in the area. This is where the game will give you some time to figure out the movement system. You're able to run along the ground and ascend into the air. It's simple but feels smooth, giving you the freedom to navigate the battlefield with ease. Flying high into the air is also a great way to get a better view of what's going on around you, as this game also has a freeform camera. Once you've had a few moments to adjust to the game's basic movement mechanics, the first enemies appear. This initial encounter should be where Battle of Z starts ramping up, but it's actually where things begin to unravel. The combat here is painfully simple, too simple. You get a basic melee attack to mash and a key blast to spam, and that basically explains half of the attacks you can do. There's no option to mix these two into any form of combo, which makes battles feel flat and repetitive. You're either punching or blasting, with the two actions feeling completely disjointed. Switching from one to the other feels stiff and unresponsive, which is disappointing because moving around the battlefield is smooth and actually enjoyable. It's a shame the core combat doesn't match that fluidity. Right after the Cyberman intro, you're quickly paired with allies for the missions ahead. Battle of Z is built around team-based combat, and every battle from this point forward is designed to be a team fight, even encounters in the story that were originally solo battles. You can assemble your own team before each mission, but in single player mode there are canon-based restrictions. For example, if you're playing a mission from the Saiyan saga, you can't throw Raditz into a fight against Vegeta, because that doesn't follow canon, even though the game lets you have 4 Gokus against Vegeta because that's more canon than having Raditz fight Vegeta apparently according to this game. However, this restriction is lifted in co-op where you have the freedom to pick any character for any mission. I'll dig deeper into the co-op specifics a bit later, but not that deep because there's a reason why I couldn't. The Saiyan Saga essentially serves as the tutorial arc, introducing you to what little variety exists in the combat. There's a bit more than just melee and ki blasts, but not much. Each character gets 2 unique attacks, however these attacks do use up a character's SP, which stands for, I don't know. I think it stands for special. The game doesn't really explain it very well, but it is essentially the resource a character pulls from to use their special and powerful moves. It can be refilled by attacking and by your teammates if they are willing to share. There are also impact strikes and blast sparks, essentially amped up versions of the melee and ki blast that use SP, and each character has one special attack like Goku's Kamehameha or Vegeta's Gallic Gun. But again, none of these attacks can really be strung into combos or anything. They all feel very isolated from each other and there is just no rhythmic flow to the combat at all. It's like the combat wants to be dynamic, but it's just not equipped to pull it off. A few characters like Trunks have unique attacks that sync up a bit better with their basic moves, creating a semblance of a combo system, but for most of the cast, it's an uphill battle to make the gameplay feel cohesive. After finishing the Saiyan Saga, I held up hope that this was just like a warm-up phase, and the game had more interesting things to offer later on. But sadly this isn't really the case. After the first few missions, you've pretty much seen everything this combat system has to offer. Playing this game is kind of like the opposite of playing chess, where if you're just watching, nothing much is happening, but in your head you're just like... But in Battle of Z, it looks like a bunch of shit is going on, but in your head you're just like... Bingo! 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 Battle of Z's major selling points are team-based battles. You can have up to 4 fighters on your team, but you will only ever be in direct control of one of them. There is no switching between characters mid-battle or anything like that. There are 70 characters that can be unlocked, which is a decent amount, although a lot of the characters do feel the same to play. An interesting aspect of this game's roster is there are 4 different character types that you will need to consider when constructing your team. Melee type characters excel in close range combat. Every attack boosts their SP, letting them build up power faster than most. Plus, if you land a full string of melee attacks, the last hit will break the enemy's guard, making it perfect for breaking through defenses. It is essentially the main DPS of the team. For ranged DPS, there is the Ki Blast type. This character specializes in Ki Blast attacks, firing them more quickly than others. Each Ki Blast they land boosts their SP, so they can build up energy fast, perfect for when you want to keep a steady stream of attacks from a distance. Support types are the healers of the group, and the fights can go sideways really quickly if you forget to add one to your team. Supports are equipped with abilities like Hyper Revive Soul to heal allies and Hyper Energy Share to boost teammates' SP. They can build up SP quickly by staying at rest or guarding attacks successfully, making them ideal for keeping the team powered up and protected. Finally, there is Interfere type. I feel like they should be called Interference type as it rolls off the tongue. Anyway, this character type excels at attacks that disrupt enemies. Their Ki Blasts are slower, but they make up for it for superb tracking, practically homing in on enemies to make dodging way harder. Plus, these blasts come with a higher chance of stunning, which can really mess up an opponent's attack. On top of that, they gain SP not from just dealing damage, but even while they're on the move or taking hits. And here's the unique twist to them. They can intercept energy blasts from Energy Share, which adds another layer to their ability to control the battlefield. Additionally, some characters come with a mix of 2 battle types, giving them extra versatility on the field. For example, you might find one who gains more SP with each melee hit, while also being able to intercept energy blasts. Or maybe they can unleash rapid fire Ki Blasts but still pull off hyper energy shares. I really enjoy the variety in the character types because it forces you to put actual thought into how you build your team. You can go without a healer to pile on the damage faster, or you can double up on the support characters and make sure your party has the endurance to push through a long, grinding battle. The system also gives you the freedom to lean into your favourite playstyle, which makes it even better. Personally, I realised pretty quickly that I'm terrible at playing the support role. Melee types became my go-to, especially when I could keep it close range, but for battles against giant characters, melee types can struggle there. So ranged characters with ki blasts are almost essential to maintain a safe distance while still landing hits. It's a great system with genuine potential, and it should make each battle feel like a unique challenge. Unfortunately, it is all undermined by the core gameplay that just cannot keep up. The combat is repetitive, so no matter how many team combinations you try, the battles end up feeling strikingly similar. Instead of dynamic, strategic fights, you're left with a sense of deja vu that sets in way too fast. The potential was absolutely there for something really engaging, but the rest of the combat system just doesn't give it the support it needs. With multiple opponents on the battlefield at once, the camera and lock-on systems are absolutely crucial here. The devs knew this, and for the most part, they managed to get the basics down. Locking onto targets usually works as intended, and I didn't find myself struggling too much to switch between foes. Where things fall apart though is in the camera's actual framing of action, which can be a bit chaotic. Sometimes the camera zooms way too far out and it becomes nearly impossible to see who's even on screen. It's like playing from a grandstand, just watching little specks clash together. Certain attacks can also throw the camera out of whack, causing it to clip through objects or angle awkwardly, making it hard to keep track of the fight. While the game does give you manual control over the camera, which helps correct these issues, it's not always easy to manage when you're trying to focus on avoiding attacks while executing your own. The moments where you're frantically adjusting the camera in the middle of a heated battle gets a bit disorientating.
Wait, what am I looking at right now? Why are you hanging off the earth like a bat?
Another persistent issue is that you'll often get blindsided by enemies who are off screen. The game attempts to help by giving you indicators from incoming attacks, which theoretically should help with dodging, but in practice it's a different story. These indicators give you a rough idea of where the threat's coming from, but they don't actually make it easier to avoid these attacks when you can't see them. Honestly, this is a flaw that plagues a lot of 3D brawlers, and to some extent I get it. Managing multiple targets in an open arena with a freeform camera is tricky. Thankfully you are able to guard and sidestep, which does help to alleviate this issue. Unfortunately, that reminds me of another issue I have with the combat. There is no technique to allow you to break an opponent's guard other than just wailing on them as a melee character. The lack of options in both offense and defense makes close quarter encounters feel very shallow and quite frankly a bit boring. I mean, there isn't any way to counter attacks either, so there is no risk of being punished for just spamming an opponent with melee and no way to, well, counter someone who's doing it to you. I'm sorry, I went on a bit of a rant there. Was it? Oh yeah, the camera. Overall, the camera and lock-on systems do what they're supposed to do, but it's not a standout feature by any means. The camera system is functional for the most part, but it does mess up quite a bit in certain situations. It's serviceable at best. It doesn't ruin the game, but it certainly doesn't enhance it either. In single player mode, your AI controlled teammates are meant to support you, with certain co-op actions that can theoretically be triggered during combat. If you and at least one of your teammates lock onto the same enemy, this sets up a linkage lock-on, where little blue arrows indicate who's locked onto the target. From there you might have the chance to perform a synchronized rush, where you and your teammates unleash a flurry of coordinated melee attacks on the enemy. But I say might because unfortunately the timing for this feels very inconsistent. This is a theme of playing with AI. Half the time, it just doesn't trigger. That's all I have to say about that. Another co-op action, the meteor chain, triggers more often, thankfully. This move allows you to walk towards the enemy after a teammate blasts them away with a chase attack, letting you continue the combo up to 4 times. A button prompt will appear on the screen that you need to press to continue the chain, but not as bad as the synchronized attack, but still inconsistent as hell, because sometimes it just doesn't trigger. You press the button and your character's like, nah, I'm not gonna do it. I don't know how else to explain what's going on apart from it don't work. In single player, chain together attacks is really hard to do on purpose. Not because they're difficult to do, but because your AI companions always feel like they're doing everything they can to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. You can give general commands, but they are only mildly effective, barely steering them towards where you need them to be. Given the Battle of Z is more multiplayer focused, this lack of reliable AI isn't surprising, but it's disappointing that there isn't a middle ground where AI teammates are at least competent enough to make the solo play engaging. While they do reasonably well in support roles at times, although there's a lot of times where your healer will not heal you. Heal me. Heal me! You can't really count on them too much when it comes to actually taking down opponents either. Basically what I'm trying to say is that the AI is a bit useless. There are many fights where your team will be outnumbering the enemy, such as many villains of the saga will often be taking on your team solo. To balance this, these major villains are transformed into damage sponges, which unfortunately makes these fights tedious more than challenging. Often these encounters lack different phases or shifts in strategy, so there's not much in terms of variety as the fight drags on. The result is a battle that feels prolonged for the sake of difficulty rather than actually being more engaging. And if you get knocked down during one of these drawn out fights, your teammates only have 5 seconds to revive you, which often isn't enough time, yet they get 10 seconds. Why do I only get 5? If you're knocked back far from your teammates, and you will be as this game frequently throws you around the map, 5 seconds just doesn't cut it. 7 or 8 seconds might have been more fair and forgiving, or just give it 10 seconds like everyone else. You also have a retry system where each character's retries are pulled into a team total. If your team collectively has 4 retries for example, then any teammate can use up to 4 if needed. Once these are gone, any further knockdowns will end the battle in a loss. You can equip items to give characters extra retries. There are a bunch of different item cards, but they are one-time use. But thankfully, the cards you use to power up your characters are not. Cards are obtained from completing missions as well as can be brought from the shop. These cards are used to customize your team and make them stronger. Each character has their own card slots and you need quite a few to fully equip a character. Luckily the game is pretty generous with giving them out, although you will need to do quite a bit of grinding to get the more powerful cards to drop or to be able to afford them from the shop, as you will also earn Dragon Ball points from completing missions, which is one of the game's currencies used to buy cards. Underneath the Dragon Ball points there are premium points, and when I first saw this my mind went into cynical mode and I was like, of course they're gonna have microtransactions to just rub salt into the milk. Thankfully though, I was wrong. Battle Z does not actually have microtransactions, as premium points are all earned by playing the game, just the way I like it. As the name suggests, premium points are a lot harder to come by. You get them as special bonuses and sharing energy, which is a whole other system tied to using ultimate attacks. Honestly, it's kind of a really interesting system, but also really lame at the same time. Let me explain. During a battle, there will be an obnoxious energy bar that will be gradually filling up. Like seriously, I have no idea why the HUD designers felt the need to make the bar this giant. Anyway, it will build up as you fight. Chain attacks will fill it up the fastest. To pull off an ultimate attack in this game, you need 2 main things. First, you need a character capable of performing an ultimate attack. Unfortunately, not every character can. Some of the characters that can are Goku, Super Saiyan 2, Teen Gohan, Broly, and a few others. The second thing you'll need is an ultimate jewel equipped to a character's item card slot. When the energy bar is filled, then only then will you be able to maybe use your ultimate attack. But that's not even the end of it. Your teammates will need to protect you as you charge it up, and finally, if it is successfully charged without being interrupted, you will then get to use your ultimate attack. It is a whole lot of rigmarole just to pull this off. At the very least, if you do pull it off, it is a guaranteed win. I only ever used the ultimate attack once in my playthrough. Alternatively, at the end of a mission, you may get a request to share your energy. By sharing energy you built up over the course of the battle, you will be rewarded with premium points. They are pretty scummy with the amount they give you. The best cards are of course in the premium shop, and they are so bloody expensive. It just makes me feel like a first time home buyer looking at real estate, realizing that I'm never going to be able to afford any of these.
Have you tried Kill All the Poor?
They are also on a timed rotation, so even if you have a bunch of premium points, there's only so much you can buy each week. I guess it was so people would have to keep returning week to week to get all the best stuff. A good thing about the customization is that the game will just automatically unequip a card if you want it on a different character. I find it so annoying when games make you go and unequip stuff manually. It's just a waste of time, so it's great that this game does make you do that. I have to say that a lot of the mission failures just felt like I just didn't have power powerful enough cards. Yes, some losses were skill issues, but there are also a fair few that were attention issues. My mind would just drift off at times because of the extremely simplistic gameplay that I would just forget to play. Let's just say I was able to catch up on a lot of podcasts while playing Battle of Z. Another aspect of this game's customization system is the ability to change the color of any of the characters' clothing, and that's it when it comes to changing the looks of any of the characters. There are no accessory rewards to unlock, nor are there any alternative outfits to unlock. This is very disappointing considering how many different outfits are featured in older titles, and you'd think this would be a great incentive for some players to grind out missions so they could show off their outfits during online play. I guess they just ran out of time to implement this aspect, as it would require all new models for over 70 characters, and going by the way the models look, they definitely didn't have enough time as it was. There is something about this era of Dragon Ball games where I think they are trying to move away from the cel-shaded style that was used in the PS2 and early PS3 era and try something different, which I can respect. You don't want every game to look the same, but with that said, I really don't like the direction the franchise went in with the graphical style of the games. They took on this kind of stiff and shiny look that I find to be quite unappealing. And Battle of Z is one of the worst examples of this, especially when it comes to the character models themselves. Some of them are really blocky and it makes their clothes look sort of like those 3D paper crafts that people make, but where that is impressive because they're made out of paper, here it just looks unpolished. Like these are the low poly versions of the characters, but they ran out of time and the high poly versions were never finished, so they just used these. You know what I mean? Some characters fare better than others. Piccolo, for instance, looks passable, but then you look at Kid Gohan and something just feels wrong. He's edging dangerously into the uncanny valley territory.
That boy ain't right.
It all feels a bit half-assed, if I'm going to be honest. Take Frieza, for example. Just set aside how off-model he is, his Scouter isn't even the right colour. Compare this to Burst Limit, a game that came out 6 years before Battle of Z. Despite a different art style, Burst Limit nails Frieza's look, whereas Battle of Z just doesn't. Sure, I get that a team-based arena fighter needs lower poly models to keep performance smooth, but that's all the more reason they should have been careful with the art style choice. What they went with here doesn't do the game any favours. And it's not just the models, it's also how they're textured and shaded. If I had to sum up Battle of Z's look in one word, it would be burnt. Every colour feels slightly overcooked, lending this dark, almost gloomy vibe to some levels. Oddly enough, I do like how many environments look in this style. Some actually have a great atmosphere, but then you put the characters in some of these backgrounds and they just feel wrong. They sometimes try to make the characters blend in with the environments by darkening them, but it goes too far. I mean, look at Cell. He looks like he's been left in the oven for way too long. I will admit that the darker setting does allow the key effects to stand out more, and they need all the help they can get because they are very lackluster. It's not that they are bad, it's just that they don't look like that much of a step up from those seen in older titles. Now, I know Battle of Z is working with more characters on screen at once, which means more chaos and more strain on the system, so they had to account for performance, but it's still so underwhelming. I just don't like the way this game looks. Some of these environments are beautiful, sure, but everything else feels out of place. There's no cohesive style, just a jumble of mismatched textures and effects. I really like Krillin's profile picture though. When you first start playing the game, you must start with the single player mode, and it's pretty telling that this mode is called single player mode and not the story mode, because this game is really not interested in telling a story, and that's honestly a huge reason why they could have skipped over the Saiyan saga. The game goes through the motions with cutscenes, but there's nothing more than brief interactions between characters, with storytelling basically thrown out the window. The cutscene animations are downright bad. There's no effort to provide backstory for any of the events, and no real character introductions or insights into their relationships. They didn't even bother with narration to set the scene before each mission, which would have helped give a sense of progression. The closest thing Battle of Z has to actual storytelling is the banter between characters during battles, and even that's sparse. If you're unfamiliar with the story of Dragon Ball Z, good luck trying to figure out what's going on, because this game is not going to explain it to you. I know I've said this about other Dragon Ball games, but Battle of Z might be one of the worst offenders when it comes to ignoring the story altogether. It's glaringly obvious that the narrative wasn't a priority here. Sure, the missions are loosely organised around different sagas, but it feels like they're just using the sagas as a battle theme rather than as an attempt to recreate the storyline. This lack of storytelling makes the whole experience feel hollow. The sagas in Battle of Z are simply there as a backdrop, a quick justification for why you're fighting certain characters in certain places, without any of the stakes or emotional weight that make those original battles memorable. It's disappointing because Dragon Ball Z is a franchise packed with incredible moments, character arcs, and emotional highs that make its story worth retelling. Here though, those moments are stripped away, leaving nothing more than a basic shell of a story mode that doesn't even really try to be engaging. When you bring up the mission timeline, you will notice that there are some branching paths that you can go down, such as playing from the villain's perspective. Also, I'd like to point out how unnecessarily small this window is. Why is it so small? Keep in mind that Battle of Z was also released on the PlayStation Vita. Where you like this? Anyway, there are some alternative routes you can take on, like playing as the villains with some film stuff and just some extra fights. For instance, you can take control of the invading Saiyans during the Saiyan saga and take the missions from their perspectives, as well as facing off against Great Ape Gohan rather than Great Ape Vegeta. In fact, there are a handful of missions where you get to face off against giant characters, and surprisingly, they are actually pretty decent. Well, decent in the sense that they work well within the game's limited combat system. The arenas are spacious enough to frame these massive opponents without crowding, so you don't feel like you're constantly craning the camera around just to see them. Plus, since these fights are typically you and your team against one big boss, you're not dealing with attacks from every angle all the time. To balance out being outnumbered, these giants pack a serious punch. Their attacks hit hard and they come with a massive health bar that'll take some real persistence to whittle down. However, you can target specific limbs, and landing enough hits on the arm or leg will stagger them for a moment. This gives you and your team a chance to unleash some heavy damage without the threat of retaliation. While these fights aren't anything amazing, they're solid for what they are, and is one of the few mission types where it feels like it makes sense that the enemy is a bit of a damage sponge, and the battles are constructed well enough to feel fun rather than frustrating. Sadly, this alternative perspective doesn't really add much narrative depth. The alternate paths and villain-centric missions don't really tell more story, they just give you different characters to play as. And as for the Battle of the Gods content, this was clearly meant to be the showstopper, the main event that would draw players in, yet somehow it is practically a non-event. The God of Destruction section is criminally short, and honestly, calling it underwhelming is generous. The cover art and advertising make it look like this section would be the real centerpiece, something to finally pull Battle of Z out of the usual DBZ game mold, but it doesn't even try to do that. If anything, this feels like a really late addition to the game, as it's not even in the main story arc of the single player. It can't be played until post-credits. Sure, Goku's new transformation makes it in, and it was a big deal at the time, so I'll give them some credit for that, but the transformations themselves feel underutilized. Like in the original Budokai Tenkaichi, transformations are handled as separate character slots rather than something you can trigger mid-battle, which removes a lot of the excitement of shifting the tide of battle by transforming. And while I don't really mind having different forms as separate characters, since they each have unique moves and sometimes even a different character type, it also feels like a missed opportunity. Imagine how dynamic team building could have been if you had the option to change a character's type mid-battle. Battle of Z is built around the idea that you'll replay missions over and over to power up your character. In theory, that's not necessarily a bad design choice. Plenty of games structure themselves around grinding missions to level up or unlock new abilities. But where this becomes a problem for Battle of Z specifically is that the core gameplay loop just isn't engaging or rewarding enough to justify all the repetition. The game expects you to keep coming back to these missions, but it fails to give you a solid reason to actually want to. For starters, there's virtually no story incentive to replay missions. The story experience is practically non-existent, so there's nothing to keep you engaged from a narrative perspective. Without a compelling storyline to dive into, you'd hope that the gameplay itself would be entertaining enough to keep things moving along, but instead the gameplay is repetitive and to be very blunt, it is mind-numbing. There's this shallow rinse and repeat feel to the combat, where every mission ends up feeling like a variation of the last. You're not advancing through missions to see how the story unfolds or to uncover any deeper character arcs. You're grinding for the sake of grinding, with no real powerful progression beyond basic stat boosts. And here's the thing, if the core gameplay was fun, maybe that wouldn't be such a problem. Plenty of games pull this off by making the grind itself rewarding, whether through fun combat mechanics, interesting enemies, or dynamic level designs. But Battle of Z falls flat here too. The enemy variety is lackluster, the combat is shallow, and the missions themselves aren't varied enough to break up the monotony. So instead of feeling motivated to replay missions for progression, I find myself dreading it. There's no anticipation, no excitement, just this grinding chore where the reward is essentially more of the same. So what you're left with is a game that's built around replayability, but lacks the essential elements that make replaying missions feel worthwhile. It's a shame really, because if Battle of Z had leaned into either a compelling story or more dynamic gameplay mechanics, it could have turned that grind into something enjoyable. Instead, it feels like you're just going through the motions, playing the same tired missions, hoping it will feel worth it eventually. But it never really does. So what makes this game worth playing? Well, if this was back in 2014, I would say that getting to fight alongside other players, or dare I say it, friends in co-op mode. Unfortunately, Battle of Z does not have local co-op, which really sucks because this game's online scene is dead, which is not uncommon for a game of this age. I tried getting into a match, but I just ended up sitting in the lobby all alone forever. I also tried to invite someone, even though I actually didn't have anyone I could play with, and it crashed the game. Twice. I had no other issues with the game running apart from that. Without actually being able to play online, I turned to older reviews and community stories from those who played at launch. Unfortunately, it seems Battle of Z struggled even then, with reports of unstable netcode and frequent disconnects. Now I realise that this is secondhand information and experiences would have varied, but it seems like the general consensus was that the online connectivity was hit and miss even from the start. Unfortunately, local co-op can be very hard for a game engine to manage, while also maintaining the performance. The biggest reason for this is that essentially the workload has been doubled. Because the console isn't just mirroring the screen, it has to recalculate and then render whatever it is the other player is doing and looking at. One of the ways that devs try to combat this is to tone down the graphics when in split screen. This isn't a cure-all, but it is usually good enough. But when the Battle of Z developers were asked why there was no local co-op, the devs explained that they wanted players to have the best possible graphics in full screen. Now, do I think this is the only reason? No, but I have no evidence to suggest that the publishers would prefer if every player had to purchase their own copy, so I'm just going to take the developers' word on this one. Since they weren't willing to sacrifice the game's graphics, there wasn't really any other workaround, and it's not like this game could just reduce the frame rate for co-op, because Battle of Z only runs at 30 FPS to begin with. Having it any lower would make it pretty much unplayable. Could you imagine playing this at 15 FPS? At the time of its release, when Battle of Z had an active online community, the co-op and versus modes probably did add a lot of fun and replayability to the game. But as with any game so dependent on online multiplayer, the passage of time has turned one of its strongest selling points into a liability. The internet moves on quickly, leaving behind games that don't support an enduring solo experience. And with Battle of Z, the loneliness of an empty lobby only serves as a stark reminder that this game has very little staying power, its appeal fading along with its once active player base. Battle of Z feels a lot like the prototype to the Xenoverse games, as built around team-based combat with a straightforward battle system and a heavy focus on grinding through missions to power up characters. It even has a warning that shows up on screen when another enemy is entering the battle. Also, the mission structure mirrors the parallel quests found in the series, yet it seems like Battle of Z was wedged in between the release of the Battle of the Gods and the first Xenoverse game. This unfortunate timing really makes it feel like Battle of Z drew the short straw, like it was rushed to the finish line to coincide with Battle of Gods and left without the polish it needed to shine. Many of the features and systems in Battle of Z feel half-baked, like an early blueprint for what Xenoverse would eventually become. In nearly every way, you can see seeds of good ideas: team combat, strategic character roles, and mission-based progression, but they're held back by repetitiveness, a lack of rewards, and unengaging gameplay. Xenoverse 1, released just a year later in 2015, picked up these concepts, executed them more thoughtfully, turning its story, combat, and progression into something that resonated a lot more with players. It's clear that Xenoverse learned from Battle of Z's fumbles and grew from them. But this leaves Battle of Z itself. It was so close to being something worthwhile, a game with real staying power. The concept wasn't the problem. It was that Battle of Z simply wasn't given the time it needed to execute its concepts well. I understand why they tried to capture the hype Battle of Gods sparked for Dragon Ball, but Battle of Z was never really built to carry the momentum forward. Instead of being a game fans revisit with fondness, it's likely to slip quietly into obscurity, more of a footnote than a milestone, a game that just couldn't reach its potential.